No, 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 no. No empiecen con la situación comercial. Acuérdense de usar el micrófono.
Most people are there and now.
Did you guys want to switch?
Por eso yo
Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Se les saluda en este segundo día de Congreso de Comercio y Género organizado por el Programa de Cátedras de la OMC y la Cátedra OMC Chile. Agradecemos a todas y todos los participantes y en especial también a los participantes de esta primera mesa, los titulares de las cátedras OMC de Latinoamérica que han estado presentes en este Congreso. Sin más preámbulo, entonces, quisiera dar la palabra, en primer lugar, a Rosemary Hernández, titular de la Cátedra OMC Costa Rica y académica de la Universidad Nacional.
Sorry, we have to do it only in English because we don't have translation.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Recording, yes.
Rosemary. Go on.
We don't need a microphone now.
Yes, you do need to go.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. We are going to talking about what is the work we do as a church program. Okay, the first the introduction. I'm going to introduce the WCP Church program, and in addition, my colleagues they are going to they are going to explain what are they doing about the area of research. In the WCP program, as Martin knows very well, we have three areas. The first area is the one area is research. In this area, we try to work together. We have several topics, but in the area of the gender, we have been working together in 2 books, I think so. We have 2 books. We are working in the 3rd book now. And in the area of curriculum development, the idea is try to strengthen our curricula in our universities. In the area of international trade, and the third area is development, research,
Outreach.
Outreach. Sorry, I promise we were a lot in outreach. In outreach, in this area, we try to work with decision makers, with civil society too. Okay, and this is the idea for the church program. We are the new church, but we have 4 years. But Chile, Dorotea is a church. Chile has, I think, 12 years as a church. Dorotea, not a program. Dorotea has 12 years being a chair in this program. And in the case of our church, in the case of Mexico, they have the same 12 years. Yes?
Phase 1.
16?
Phase 1. We're
Okay.
phase 1, yes.
Okay, and in the case of yes, in the case of Costa Rica and Peru, we have 4 years, okay? And Martin is our father. Believe us? The founding father. The founding father.
Makes me very old. I'm your father.
Yeah, we appreciate your support, Martin, forever. Okay, this is just the introduction. And now, my colleagues, they are going to speak about what we are doing in the research area.
Well, thank you very much, Rose, for giving this good introduction of the work that the WCP program does. Now I'm gonna give the floor to Amrita Bari, who is the chair of the Mexico chair Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. Thank you very much, Amrita.
Thank you, Ignacio. Well, Rosemary very successfully introduced what we do as WTO chairs, because I think she laughed more than she told you. And that's exactly what we do. We laugh more, we have more fun than we work. We are friends more than colleagues. And I think that's the best thing that the chairs program has given us, the friendship with each other, right? The community of friends and this new family that we've come together with. So I will talk about this new book project that some of us here in Latin America, the WTO chairs, have started to work on. We started working on this book in March, in February, March this year, and it's titled The 7 Pillars of Inclusive Trade Policy. Why? So the vision behind this book is very important. What we are trying to achieve in this book is to bring the discussion on or the understanding on inclusive trade policy to the next level, which is provide a comprehensive strategic definition to the concept of inclusive trade policies. Because whenever we talk about inclusive trade policies in the policy corridors, we normally restrict the discussion of inclusive trade policies to trade in women or trade in indigenous communities, trade in youth. So we look at inclusive trade policies in an isolated manner, right? In this book, what we are trying to do, we are trying to build a framework, comprehensive framework, to define what is inclusive trade policy, and going forward, how can trade agreements and negotiations leading to trade agreements can treat the subject of inclusive trade policies. Not in an isolated way, but considering all the factors of marginalization that cut through and come across when we talk about inclusive trade policies. So, what are we trying to do in this book? We are trying to design an inclusive trade policy framework considering 5 dimensions. 5 dimensions which will help us identify and assess marginalization. Right? The first factor that will help us assess marginalization is social and cultural identity. In this book, sorry, I forgot to say, I should have said this before. In this book, we have the introductory foundation chapters on inclusive trade policy, where we introduce the framework based on different marginalization factors. And then we have 7 chapters. We have 7 chapters. Each chapter focuses on one pillar of marginalization. My friend Gerard focuses on a chapter. He's writing a chapter on trade and LGBTQ+. My friend on the left, Ignacio, is doing a chapter on trade and youth. With him is Victor. He's doing a chapter, also my friend, doing a chapter on trade and indigenous communities. Running way late though, he hasn't sent me his draft. So we have come together to work on 7 different pillars of marginalization. We have 3 chapter authors here, and the 4th one is sitting back there, Judith Fabian. She's doing a chapter on trade and women empowerment. So we have the 4 pillar authors right here, and then we have 3 other pillars. One is trade and race, the other is trade and region or poverty, and forgetting the 7th one, which is the 7th. No. Disability. Trade and persons with disabilities. And we have, that is one in work. So we have these 7 chapters, which will help us understand the intersection between trade policies, trade agreements, and different factors of marginalization. Now, how did we come across these 7 pillars? We identified them using 5 dimensions. The first dimension is social and cultural identity. What do we try and see in this dimension? which groups are affected by social and cultural identities, how these identities are impacted by trade policies, and do trade policies and agreements ensure equal access to opportunities for all groups intentionally, or whether they leave them out intentionally or unintentionally based on their social and cultural identity. So these are the questions that we ask throughout, like in all the chapters, based on social and cultural identity. Our second dimension is geographic fairness. In that aspect, we try to answer whether trade policies and agreements favor urban areas over rural areas, are remote regions and the barriers they face being considered in the formation of such policies, and are agreements and policies creating more inequality between developed and developing nations, and how can we bridge this inequality going forward? The third dimension that we look at is economic equality. Are trade policies and agreements widening or narrowing the income gaps, and are they creating fair job opportunities across different income levels? And the second question is, are smaller businesses or informal workers included in trade benefits and opportunities? The fourth dimension that we look at is political representation. Are marginalized groups included in trade policy decisions or negotiations, or are they left out? Well, as the powerful slogan goes, nothing about us without us. I learned about the slogan when I was doing a study for trade policies and persons with disability. Because one of my interviewees said, nothing about us without us. And when we were talking about how we can negotiate provisions that can increase the affordability and access to assistive devices for persons with disability in developing countries through trade agreements, because trade agreements increase the intellectual rights protection of these products, and that has made it more difficult for persons with disability, mainly in developing countries, to access assistive devices and assistive products that makes their lives easier. So these are the questions that we look at in the third dimension. The fourth dimension, I've already talked about the fourth dimension, which is the political representation. Essentially meaning that no decisions or policies should be made about a particular group of people without their direct involvement and inputs. So that leads us to believe that there has to be very strong public-private stakeholdership, public-private partnership and exchange when it comes to formation of inclusive trade policies. And the fifth and the final dimension that we are looking at throughout, it's cross-cutting throughout the chapters, is access to productive resources. Can trade policies and agreements really support the needs of marginalized communities to have access to productive resources, such as education, skill training, finance, digital technology, know-how, and others, to enable them to participate more in trade? And moreover, are decision makers and negotiators who are forming these policies aware of the barriers that these marginalized groups face in accessing productive resources? So in this sense, our framework, our new framework that's going to come up in this book, it focuses on these 5 key dimensions: identity, geography, economics, politics, and access to resources, providing us a very organized, a very comprehensive way to think about and going forward to discuss and negotiate inclusive trade policy provisions in trade policies and trade agreements. I will now give the floor to Victor Sacco, who's our chair from TEDU, to talk about his chapter on trade and indigenous communities. And then Ignacio and Gerard will share their own wisdom.
Thank you very much, Amrita. And as my colleagues have said before, being the WCP chairs in Latin America is not just an academic experience, but it has been helpfully and gratefully a friendship experience. And I think that reinforces the ties and makes it work even better and more productive. About my chapter of indigenous population, the idea was to connect this situation with the other topics, because also to belong to an indigenous population, it could be a transversal topic. So a people that recognize itself as indigenous people, they also could be women, could be men, could be belonging to the LGBTI community. So they could be poor, they can have money or not. So it's something that is connected to their just being. So that was the idea, to see if that situation is really recognized in the free trade agreements and the international treaties. So the research so far show us that yes, we have many clauses in different free trade agreements around recognize the indigenous populations and how their rights have to be respected. It's interesting though that in the case of my country, Peru, that according to the last census, 67% of us recognize ourselves as indigenous population or related to indigenous populations. The clauses that we have in our FTAs do not recognize indigenous population rights, except for intellectual property, or in our last FTA with China, in the relation with poor people. So maybe there is something to advance in that sense. It's different than the situation where we got New Zealand, where the relation with indigenous people has been recognized. And also it's difficult for the case of Peru, and I'm sorry for speaking of our case, because our first free trade agreement that was conducted with the United States at the moment of implementation had really a deadly effect. And I'm taking deadly literally because 7 people just died on demonstrations against the implementation of the FTA, specifically on the chapter on woods, because the FTA with the United States allow Peru just to loticize the woods and just to sell it and use it for commercial purposes. So the indigenous populations were using the woods for other reasons, really opposed to this situation. So we had to amend the FTA just before it passed 3 years later. So that's maybe one effect that could have FTA if their people is not consulted. So regarding to one of the questions, as Enrique already told you, how these identities or the indigenous populations' identities affect trade policies. I have already told you about one of the worst situations where you don't consult them. But the other preoccupation is, do the states really consult indigenous populations just before to plan these chapters or plan this art? Do they really talk with them? We have like successful cases like in New Zealand, where there is a strong community and they really are aware of their rights and really fight for their rights and try to put them. There are some cases of consultation in Canada where the ministry is also not really, but well, so maybe I have to check my information, where the ministry really talk with these populations just to have them involved. And there is some cases where there is just copy paste of the treaty and just put it there. So it's possible, as a third point, it's really possible to implement these treaties internationally. I mean internationally because there is a possibility that inside of the course of each country to take the treaties and to try to make them respected inside our jurisdiction. But the interesting idea about to use these treaties at the international level is really interesting. And we had a case recently, now it's 2 years ago, between the United States and Mexico, because Mexico planned to have a ban on genetic modified corn from the United States. So the United States opposed, also Canada in the dispute via the mechanism of the USCNA. And Mexico just used an exception, the exception of indigenous populations, to try to defend its measure. That was not accepted by the panel, not because maybe they didn't discuss too much on the exception, but it was the way how Mexico took the measure and been consulted as it was in the treaty to the other parties. But it was a first case when you can use indigenous population exceptions just to protect indigenous rights inside the country. So, so far, and just to conclude, what we have learned till the moment. So, the involvement of indigenous populations in the negotiations and implementation of the treaties could be crucial, and also prevent deaths. And to now all that we have these clauses, I don't want to say educate, because I think it's not in one way, but also the chairs could just provide more information to indigenous populations. Is the case of the chair of Peru, where we have indigenous people involved to provide them information so they can empower their rights and take the most of the profits from the treaties that we have. That's from my part. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Victor, for giving this overview of the chapter about indigenous people in the 7 pillars of inclusive trade policy. Also, thank you, Amrita, for giving this detailed overview also of the whole book. Now I'm going to give the floor to Gerald Solano, which is the co-chair, who is the co-chair of Costa Rica, and also an academic of the Universidad Nacional. Thank you very much, Professor Solano. Go on.
Thank you, Ignacio, thank you all for this morning. Well, in our case, my chapter was working with Isabella from Colombia's share. We were discussing about how to create inclusive trade policy that emphasize the rights and needs for the LGBTQ community. Because once we started with the share in Costa Rica, I find out that when in the WTO talks about gender and trade, gender is synonymous of straight, gender, white, straight women. And at that moment, we were thinking, well, what happened with the other population that are not included? And when we start talking about this, obviously at the beginning, it was like a human rights view. We have to include everybody, to get benefits from international trade or the benefits of trade as well. But it's a difficult discussion at this moment. This is not a popular topic with what is happening in the United States with the President Trump. And we said, well, we're going to take the challenge to talk about how LGBT community are facing discriminations and not equal opportunities, because we find out that the legal framework is not ensuring that policies are aligned with anti-discrimination laws or protecting LGBT individuals in employment, business ownership, or access to markets. And as well, we are not getting funding, for example, for LGBT-owned businesses. And once that we start discussing this, we find out as well that if we don't want to see it from the human rights point of view, it's important in the economical way. For example, some studies from the Credit Suisse Bank says that if the LGBT community would be a country, our GDP would be $4.5 billion. So that means that there is a good space for goods and services for LGBT community. Actually, last year, Los Cabos in Mexico, they received more than $45 million just the 2024 year for LGBT services in hotels and all the, and all the things that they have built around the LGBT community. But we are facing as well missing awareness programs, for example, in how to implement training programs for trade officials, for businesses, for stakeholders, and as well how to develop some skill, because in our case, in Central America, for example, if we are talking about transgender women, their expectation of life is 35 years. So they are not thinking about international trade. They are thinking about how to survive that 35 years, line for life. So in that case, we have to work and how to disaggregate data, because at this moment, if one transgender woman is skills in El Salvador, Honduras, they are going to register that on-site or that suicide as a man. For example, Carlos that, but it was Carla because they didn't have the identity on the ID. So with this missing information, we can move forward. So that's the biggest challenge that we have right now, because some countries, obviously they are not agreed. We are talking about this. And the other is how we can build international cooperation. For example, how do we have global standards advocated for international trade agreements that includes provision for the protection and promotion of LGBT rights. And the other is how the the best practices, and just so I remember the good practices, not the best practices, the good practices, sharing how collaborate with other countries to share these good practices and strategies for creating inclusive trade policy. And that's how we start talking with Amrita about not just talk about trade and gender, or just instead talk about inclusive trade with some others population. And in the chapter as well at the end, we have included some safe and inclusive trade environments, how to build it, how to do anti-harassment policies, implementing the forces policies to prevent harassment and discrimination in trade-related environments, or how to create safe spaces for LGBTQ individuals to engage in trade activities with fear of abuse or violence. For example, last year I had the opportunity to share a panel in the public forum with Amrita and Nadia and Anush, and I remember that I was telling them, for a gay person, I have to look where are my flight schedule, because I'm sure that I can be, for example, in Moscow, or I can be in some other country because it's dangerous for myself, for my security. So that's the things that LGBT people has to think about if they are planning to move, around the world to do business. So for tourism, because at the end, we are, willing to pay more in some cases for a flight or for a hotel, just to know that you are safe. And that is a very good business opportunity, because if you are willing to pay more, well, if you want to see it from the business or the economical part, let's do it. But the important thing here is that we have to think with finally the chapter, how to do this sustainable and a long-term commitment. Because when Trump arrives in the United States, we have been seeing that this depends on the will of the politicians, on the presidency. So how do we have long-term goals? How we set a long-term goal for inclusion for the LGBT community in trade policies and ensure a sustainable commitment from all the stakeholders? And how can we promote these trade practices that benefit LGBT community and contribute to their economy empowerment? And I don't know if I'm allowed to say something about what we included in the chapter, because it's not public yet, but I think the relationship between international trade and LGBT rights was analyzed in an area that is still requires further research and innovative approaches to incorporate these issues meaningfully. To illustrate this need, the chapter began to examine the current geopolitical context of trade policy. Then it explored the sustainability dimension, and before turning our attention to trade agreements, where we identify a clear imbalance, while many agreements include gender provision, for example, in the USMA explicitly, but to refer to LGBT community is just a mention. At least we have that, but we have to move forward. And at the end, for me, it's very important to understand that this probably is not moving as fast as we needed and we wanted to do. But the important thing is that we are discussing this. We are including this in a concept, in a framework of inclusive trade, and I think that it's a way to start thinking about inclusive policy and how international trade can really benefit to everyone. So thank you for the invitation to be part of the chapter, and we are here for some comments.
It's so interesting that you say, right? Because the provisions that you're mentioning talk about trade and gender in common. And so, and even though the conference is titled Trade and Gender Equality, I just feel that from my reading and my understanding of how the provisions are drafted from a legal point of view, they are intentionally be drafted in with such a broad scope that they can practically include everything under the sun. Just like the exception of Article 28, protection of public morality. We have seen as trade lawyers and trade economists the problems that we've run into when we include such broad provisions with terminologies that have a very ambiguous, a very vague scope. And I think we are falling in the same trap by referring to these different aspects of marginalization under a broad term of trade and gender. Because we are probably, in a way, giving it to countries that have positive conditions to use these tools as tools to reduce comparative advantage of countries that might have adverse conditions towards marginalized communities in this sense through trade agreements. And in that sense, we are probably increasing the trust deficit between the developed and the developing world, is my feeling. So I think going forward, it's really important for us as scholars to try and focus on or to try and reconsider the typology that we are using when we talk about inclusive trade or trade in women or trade in LGBTQ. Because I wonder if the continued use of trade in gender would really help me or you as an LGBTQ scholar or for me as a woman scholar to really serve the purpose that we are trying to serve. Or whether we are really trying to go in the loop and probably creating more problems than there already are. I'll give some words to Ignacio, who will talk about his chapter on trading rules.
Well, thank you very much, Gerald, and thank you, Angelita. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the youth chapter in this book, which is still being developed. That's why it's gonna be very short. This is being written with the colleague Nadia Hasham. And what we found is that, as you know, the youth is not a permanent condition, so it's difficult to try to identify which public or private policies can address this issue, this topic, this sector of the population to try to leverage their participation in international trade. For instance, the difficult access to loans is one of the main difficulties that this group has to face. What we found in the case studies of Chile and Kenya, there are fragmented policies that address youth. For instance, in the case of Chile, they try to address poverty issues or public participation issues or entrepreneurship issues, but they are really dissociated one of another. We have, in the case of Chile, one public agency specialized in youth, but this agency does not address international trade issues, but just domestic trade. And that even domestic trade is really initial as public initiatives. Also, in the public sector, specialized in international trade and trade policies, the ward or the department focusing on inclusive trade does not address the youth group. And also, when we try to engage with private associations that are also, of course, specialized in exporting and international trade, they do have, some of these associations, they do have inclusive trade groups, but they are also focusing only in women in international trade. So, yeah, one of the main primary results of this book is, yeah, it is a group, it is a pillar of inclusive trade that is not being addressed at a group level right now. But as I said at the beginning, this is still being developed, it's still being written, so we will be in conditions of better explaining results in the near future, I hope.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Let's see.
I'm stepping onto your terrain as a moderator.
Let's see.
I mean, you said it's a condition. You said it's not a condition. It's a phase of life. It's a temporary phase of life. So why do we need to talk about it? And why do we see youth as a factor of marginalization?
Well, that's a good one. I would say that, yeah, because of the factor that is a temporary condition in life, the youth are not only in trade issues, they are often leave behind, such as the child population regarding many rights. So in terms of, this is a broad situation that happens in in a lot of areas of public policies, trade and international trade is a part of it. So I would say that why it's important, because youth population, they do have a lot of potential to engage in international trade and to oxygen this area of public policy, private practices, and to be in a better condition to talk in as inclusive trade as a whole new concept, and not only, as we've been discussing, it's not only women. There are many other groups that can engage in this concept to leverage trade conditions in the world. So thank you for that question. As we all have talked about our chapters, and Professor Hernandez talked at the beginning of what the chair programs do. I'm gonna give this last minute to ask if one of you want to give final remarks about your chapters or your work at your same chapter in your chairs, some of your projects. Please, Victor.
Sorry for this publicity, but but I mean the publicity is. I think the chairs and the professors and the people that we work in the chairs, we're really open to discuss with you if you have projects and you want to integrate with the scholars in Peru. Maybe you will see the same in your countries. If you want to integrate your work with the work that we're doing, I think it's a good opportunity, because the chairs program, it was meant, as the DG said, to be ambassadors of the WTO. Ambassadors in the academic sense, so we are open to work in an MFN condition, so most favored nation condition. So we're open on non-discrimination to try to work together in the topics that are related to trade. And who knows, because we are academics, even we can contact you with other people that maybe also work in your topics. That was the question.
Thank you, Victor. Anyone else would like to give final remarks about the work or current or future projects in the chairs?
Well, in our case, we are working in another book about inclusive trade and trade and gender, but this is a book that it will be in Spanish. It's a point of view from this topic from Latin America. So we are working with some colleagues from the WTO chairs from Latin America, but with some other researchers for each specific topics. For example, we are seeing or we are dividing the book in three parts. One, the challenges in the global tendencies about this perspective of gender. So we are working with Anush in one chapter about how this trade and gender topic started in the WTO. It's like the first chapter to try to orientate the people and how this discussion started at the WTO. Then I'm writing a chapter about how this has to go more than gender synonyms of women. And Gabriela, our researcher from Costa Rica, she's writing a chapter about how to link trade policy in gender in multilateralisms and regionalisms areas. In the third part, we are seeing how all the provision with Dorotea and Camila, the trade policy provision of gender in the free trade agreement and the investment are included. But then we have some researchers from, for example, from Mexico, from the south part of Mexico. They wrote a chapter about the USMCA free agreement in gender and how the provisions and all that, they are examining that. Another researcher is seeing the Central America system of integration in gender. So Isabela and Victor are working about the Alianza del Pacífico, gender and all that, the digital gender gap that they find out in the Alianza del Pacífico. Michel Levy and his group are working about the Comunidad Andina in gender, and Rita about Jitaga, Ignacio about the CPTPP in gender, because we wanted to, to have a view on how this is moving in all the agreement. And the third part, we have some researchers from Central America, and we wanted to know how trade and gender is seen from the Central America's countries. So we have researchers from each Central America country, and from their perspective, they are seeing this. This is a book that we will finish the next year. We are finishing Rita's book, so we hope that the next conference we can share some of the advances of this other book. And as you know, well, so some of you know, because we were talking yesterday about this in Costa Rica next year, it's going to have elections, and we are now working on a presidential debate with the candidates, just focuses on international trade, what they're expecting, how the Costa Rica role is going to be. So this way the share try to to give an income to the elections people, to the voters and all that, to understand, because international trade or international affairs, in our case, it's not a topic of the debates. They talk about the local economy or security, immigration, and some other, but international trade and international affairs, it's not part of the TV debates and all that. So as a share, we have understood that this is important, and it's not going to be as a traditional debate. For example, that some academics go with a very fancy question for the candidates. This is going to be a youth dialogue. We are choosing some students, and they are going to talk like a podcast thing with the candidates. Each one, it would be a truly conversation, not just some specific question. It's a conversation with them, but about international trade and international affairs, because their perspective is changing. When Ignacio was answering Amrita, I was telling Amrita, the young people, they are pushing to change things. They are using social media to e-commerce, as Simonetta was telling us yesterday, and they need some more faster in this topic. So this is somehow that we are giving to the young students from our universities in Costa Rica a space to dialogue with the candidates for next year. So we will let you know how this at the end works out, because our students are really excited, but we are going to have this on January next year. But it's part of what we are now doing. I don't know if Rosemary want to add something on Canesi or something.
No.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Gerald, for these final remarks, and now give the floor to Amrita, please.
I probably want to wrap up if no one else has anything to say with an announcement. And then we can open up for questions, yes. There's an announcement that we would like to make as the chairs and on behalf of our friends that are here as well. We do want to confirm that this conference is not a one-off affair. We have decided to make it a permanent feature. An annual event. So we're going to have a WCP chair on trade and gender equality. Or we'll think about the typology. I don't want to say women. An annual event, and it will happen around every single year between October and December. And it will be hosted by one of our chairs on a rotational basis. Next year, our friend from Peru has agreed to host us. So next year, we're going to Peru, to Lima, in November. We will be following up with you on the dates very soon. And so we do want to make it a permanent feature, a platform that we as WTO chair in Latin America would like to offer to the current scholars as well as the future scholars and the upcoming scholars in this field to promote their scholarship, to give them a safe space to talk about their thoughts, their research findings, and to brainstorm their research ideas and vision going forward with us, with scholars who have already burnt out. And we've been facing all these struggles in the field of trade and gender every now and then. So to give you the safe space and a platform of visibility, we've decided to make it a permanent feature, and we really hope to see you next year in Lima. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, and the shareholders for this important announcement. Now I'm gonna give the space for the questions of the audience. I saw some hands raised. I'm gonna start over here, please. Yeah. Thank you, Antonita.
Thank you. This was very, very interesting. I have a question and a comment. A question is, so why have you thought about including among these marginalized communities the rural population? Because, for instance, if you look at digital trade, rural population are really marginalized, and there are what are called the blind spots. That is, that there is no internet coverage in many rural areas, especially in Africa. So you have included youth, but I don't know, perhaps
Yes, we have.
the rural no, youth, I know you have included, but I was wondering if you have included the youth, why not? That, as you said, is a transitional phase of life as we. So why not to look at the rural population? And then the comment is, I mean, I understand that there are, and of course, there are all these groups, all these segments of the population that are marginalized. But if we think about women, we are talking about half of the world population. If we talk about whatever LGTB or people with disability, we are talking about a much, much smaller proportion of the population. So I don't know if we can say the same thing regarding half of the world population or regarding some groups that of course deserves attention and respect, but the magnitude is completely different. And then something I have noticed, and this happens when the words are not clear, so can be interpreted in different ways. There is, now that there is, I mean, we can say it clearly, a backlash against women, women rights, etc. Talking about inclusive trade can be used as a way to dilute the debate. So we talk about women, we talk about this, we talk about so many things that at the end we don't know what we are talking about and what we want to reach. So I think there is a need to balance this very legitimate goal to be comprehensive with the risk of having a very diluted and then not very effective conversation.
Thank you very much. Considering the time issues, we're gonna group all the questions. So we're gonna answer at the end, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that very interesting discussion that you're having and what you're working on. Very interesting. My questions are going to be a bit provocative. Having managed the program for so many years, what you're doing is very interesting, very important, very critical. But my provocative question is, how many books do you want to do on the same topic? That's one question. Given that there are other geopolitical issues that are very interesting at this moment in time on critical minerals, on AI, on other topics that I think would be important for your chairs to be working on in this geopolitical world. So I don't want to discourage you to continue working on that because it's very important, but that's one question. I think it would be good to diversify your interest also on economic topics that are really relevant for your economic development today. That is one question. The second question is, I'm very encouraged to see your intra-regional cooperation on this particular topic. My question is, this is a horizontal topic that is across the world. Are you working on the same topic with the other regions in Africa and Asia and wherever it is? Are they working? Are you stimulating? Are you sharing data and knowledge? I mean, I know that in this conference here today, we have different world perspectives on the same issue, but are you working with the other chairs to share your information, your findings, that there will be like a horizontal look at some of these questions? These are my two main points that I would like to make.
Thank you very much. Who's next? Towards you, okay.
Thanks very much. Sounds super great. I'm looking forward to the books. I was wondering if you are dealing with labor chapters and labor issues, given speaking of geopolitics, one of the most contentious issues facing trade agreements today. And related to LGBTQ, I have an article in Globalizations in which I argue that a labor chapter may be the most effective way to promote gender equality. And if you look at the language in the USMCA, or CUSMA, as we like to call it in Canada, it has some of the most progressive language anywhere around discrimination and violence in the workplace around LGBTQ issues. However, the US inserted a footnote in that clause saying that that clause doesn't apply to the US. So I think it's very an interesting issue, but an area for improvement in future trade agreements. And then there's a whole can of worms about quantitative approaches, and you were talking about gender disaggregated data, and it always bothers me that the quantitative approaches always have male, female as the only options, which seems to me to reinforce gender binaries. So I wonder if you thought about that, Gerald. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now we're having the last one.
Yes. So it's sort of, yes, it's sort of a question and also an offer. Yeah. So it just caught my attention that Gerald, you were mentioning that one of the chapters that you're planning to include in your new book is how this discussion sort of came about at the WTO. And I did my first round of interviews at the WTO on this topic in 2007. So that was 18 years ago. Now, at that point, I signed some strict confidential agreements. So the interviews as such never surfaced the way that they were, done. But I still have them. So maybe if there is a way to sort of negotiate to open up those files to the public for academic purposes after so many years, then I would love to do that and to sort of go back in a sense, sort of do archival research in the sense of, what was the discussion about 18 years ago. And some of the people who are on record are still very active, whether, in the profession or sort of retired and doing their circuits elsewhere. But yeah, I'm the safekeeper of those records. So if there is a way to sort of share them, I would love to share them in your book. So do you need help with the chapter and the offer? That's the question. And the offer is the sort of the interview.
You're more than welcome. So thank you very much for all the questions. I'm gonna kindly ask the chairs to respond very briefly to all the questions because we have another person coming. I'm gonna, Rosa, you wanna?
Yes, it's related with Martin question. Okay, it's not easy work together, you know. But we are trying to do our best. Okay, the idea is to start with this topic. However, we have been working in other topics, for example, digital trade. We have been working about digital trade. Right now, we have a book with collaboration with some of the church program, and related with the other church programs around the world. I think it's a good challenge. Maybe next year in the June, in our meeting in June in Geneva, we have to discuss that, because all the discussion has been for areas, for example, Latin America, Asia, and as you know. Then maybe it's a good topic to discuss next year, how we are going to work together in topics that we are interested in, we have interest about that.
Just to complement that, in the case of Peru, we are working together in just in digital divide and also critical materials with the Shanghai chair of China, because China has two chairs.
Well, in my case, I think that the segregated data, just female or male, it is one of the challenges that we have, how to create a methodology, you know, to get access to all the population. Because, for example, some estimated data now says that 12 to 15% of the population are part of the LGBT community. Just in the United States, the last census said that 26% of the population identified as part of the LGBT.
Higher.
Exactly. And that's I think that's the matter. How we create a methodology to get access to that data, to identify how many people are part of that community. But in for example, in Costa Rica, the thing that we have is 12% of the population are, or at least they are saying that they are part of the LGBTQ community, because we don't know how much people are part of the community, but they can say for religious reasons, for cultural reasons, for family reasons. I don't know, there are so many reasons. So we are thinking in how to create this methodology to get this information. For example, when I was in Salvador last October, last year we were talking about this, and at the end of the academy conference, two people came to me and said, like, be careful what you're saying, because you are talking about LGBTQ, here is dangerous to, they find out that you are gay and you are researching about this. So that's the challenge that we have with this data. And in some countries, it started to be easier when in the passport you can just say other or identify that binary or non-binary. But for example, in the United States, that is changes right now. A couple of weeks, President Trump said that it's not going to be in the passport anymore. So it's it was a little door to try to get the data. But this is the challenge. We are thinking about that. But I would like to see the paper. Thank you very much for what you said. And Edith, you are more than welcome on board.
We just need to be sure that, I can actually do it.
We can talk about that then.
Okay.
You're already
You're on board now.
Okay.
2 minutes, okay. So, to Simoneta's questions, the first one, yes, we are including a chapter on rural population and rural areas. So this is a chapter that exclusively focuses on, it looks at the intersection between creative greenness, rural and vis-a-vis urban population, and its intersection with poverty. So this is a chapter on that. And it's coming from an author from Nepal, chair from WTO chair from Nepal. About the inclusive trade, as to whether it can dilute the entire sort of debate, we've already seen this problem happening with sustainable STD provisions or STD chapters, right? Sustainable development and trade chapters that were included, that have been extensively included in European trade agreements, for example. The aim here is not to provide another umbrella concept and hide all the different concerns of different marginalized communities. The idea is to raise understanding on how these different factors of marginalization, first, that they exist. There are different factors of marginalization. They're not just one or two. And how do they intersect? How do they cross-cut each other? That's the idea. We want to increase understanding, increase awareness on the cross-cutting nature and what happens when these different factors of marginalization cross-cut and they magnify the barriers. Because when the barriers get magnified with a range of different layers of marginalization factors, then you have to come up with different kinds of solutions. Then the standardized solutions in trade agreements won't work for that kind of marginalization. And finally, labor issues. Laura, $1 million question, right? So I think I completely agree with you. Labor issues and labor chapters are probably one of the most enforceable and meaningful or effective way, right, implementable way to bring in these social concerns. But I also want to share, and I also want to say that we need to get this straight. Labor issue, and even though we say labor issue is, it's a non-market access, it's a market access issue, right? So labor issue is not a social issue. Labor issue is not a question about sustainable development. Labor issue is probably, we can talk about it, but labor standard is clearly a factor of production. It directly impacts production and economic efficiency, and that is probably why US has completely bought this concern and sold it to USMCA, and it's super enforceable with a rapid enforcement mechanism, not because it's a social concern, not because US wants to improve the lives of poor people in Mexico. Of course, that's not the case, right? And it's only because yesterday, the president of the US was calling a few people from developing countries a garbage bag, right? So these are the terminologies being used by the administration. Exactly, right. But what I'm trying to say is that labor concerns and labor standards have become enforceable to an extent that social concerns, or to a place where social concerns can no longer reach or cannot reach in the foreseeable circumstances or given situations. Because labor concerns are directly related, they are trade germane concerns. And gender equality, indigenous communities, youth are not. We have not been able to prepare the link. We have not been able to build the case that these concerns are trade germane. You may not agree, and you may say, well, yes, they are also clearly related to trade. And I also agree, and I want to say that they're clearly related to trade. Trust me on that. But we have not been able to prepare the same connection. And therefore, I think when we talk about labor and trade, we are in a way backbiting ourselves, because we cannot follow the same track for trade in gender, trade in youth, trade in indigenous communities, trade in women, trade in LGBTQ+, because labor is a very trade germane concept and a factor of production. So yeah, I don't think that.
Yeah. So thank you very much to the audience, our chairs. Now we're gonna move to our next panel. Thank you for your question.
Gracias al Instituto por haber va a ser el programa de organización de
Facing over there. Marty, for a question.
How many books you didn't say? How many books?
Purpose of this bag, we have talking about gender.
Peter, you work with Peter.
There's so many of them working on digital ID and we know social concerns.
It's very important for in America because the Chinese are buying all the lines.
And the critical minerals is so crucial. So I am working on critical minerals. So I have a project with UNSC And I'm also working on AI, that I'm trying to see how AI can be added in dispute technology. So, but so I'm working on these two areas, very interesting, very important.
Because I think it's.
Yeah.
Once.
It's also very revenue generating area. If I really honestly, like countries don't know about what's going on and they want to raise their awareness. So like for me as a consultant, like what my role as an academic, I get a lot of programs developing awareness, discussing papers and whatnot. All the other how do you of course, right? But then the other area is AI. AI, the role AI can play in negotiation and settlement. It's very interesting. So I have an ongoing project. Oh yeah, I have an ongoing project.
You were like, I should have just disappeared.
Yeah, I know. Really awesome.
It was an interesting talk. It was very. We have.
Yes, I sent you this file. Yes, I think. That's why I probably haven't.
Yeah.
So please bring these.
Which is an external. It's not out. When is that?
Yes, yes.
Which is nicer.
Oh, wait.
For me, it's just talking.
So we have. Yes. One. Oh, the line, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, it's right there.
Looks
Please, where it is.
Exactly.
No, go. It's an hour and a half. One second, I need my staff.
You can give me a sign.
Nice to meet you.
But I don't,
You know what, I left mine in my.
but everyone is saying that.
No, I know that I left mine there, there's my.
Okay, so I say. Second, they have to be random answers. Okay.
Are you after? What's the next one?
You can start seeing that we're waiting for vehicles in the map.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Or should have already showing that we will start soon.
I mean, maybe, so the online presenters can be like, we have to be like. You can change the seats if you want.
Let's change the slide.
It's right here. Yeah, do you have slides? No?
I follow.
No, it's okay. I was like, maybe I'm not prepared.
No, okay, no, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So we're like, you then?
Where are you from? Italy. Okay. I know what I was saying. Yes. So I wanted to remember turn on the microphone.
Do you need that one? You can no, no, that's not. It's not like
I didn't know.
Are you sure? Okay. Okay, your water. Perfect. Perfect. So whenever you want.
So you have this.
It's right here. That one to go forward, let's go back. Yes. We can do that. Otherwise we can help. Yes. Smile please. Oh, our photographer is taking pictures, so.
Hello. Hola. There's some later. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
Es que está muy full for me over there. No voy a hacer.
¿Tiene control?
No, no sé que no.
Greetings, everyone. Present here and who have joined us online. Welcome to the first panel of the day, Access to Medicines, Trade Finance, and Women's Rights. So this is an issue that is at the intersection of many topics, like global trade governance, public health, finance, and gender equality. All these do not just shape individual livelihoods, but broader economic resilience and human rights outcomes. So with the panel, they bring together with their topics very complex linkages together, like intellectual property rules, healthcare access, to the gender dimensions of trade finance, to the need for inclusive budgeting, to women's experiences in GVCs and business conduct abroad. I would request the speakers to first introduce themselves a bit and then go ahead with their topic. So today's first presentation comes from Tanya Sebastian, and I apologize to everyone beforehand if I butcher your name, I'm sorry. So Tanya Sebastian, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. So nice to see all of you and to finally be able to present my topic. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope it's visible. It okay?
Yes.
So if I press slideshow, I think everyone can see. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Before you, sorry, you have 10 minutes.
Yes.
And I'll give you a reminder 3 minutes. When you have 3 minutes, so you can wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as you can see, the title is Trade and Gender, specific to India, but also very specific to patents and medicines. So as was correctly pointed out, my presentation is very much inclined towards the intellectual property aspect of trade and gender, so trade and women. So I have 3 public health dimensions that I'm going to address. But before that, I'm sure we are all aware of the placement of, the global south and developing countries when it comes to TRIPS and in the post-TRIPS era, especially in the Indian context, where we had to incorporate both products and process patents in the case of pharmaceutical patents. We are also aware of the importance of health in various conventions and declarations. So combining these 2 concepts, there are 3 public health dimensions that I'm going to look at today. One is the role of the Indian judiciary and the compulsory licensing regime under the patent law in India that India has explored. The second one is a question based on affordability and accessibility of patented medicines in a post-TRIP world, seen through the lens of select FTAs. So for today's presentation, at least I've taken only one, but because it's a work in progress, I aim to expand the work further. And lastly, the realities of the gendered nature of diseases in the Indian context. So India's history when it comes to the free trade agreements begins from its association with Sri Lanka, which goes way back. And up to 2025, India has entered into 19 regional trade agreements, some of which are FTAs and partial scope agreements. So because I'm going to start with what the Indian policymakers and the Indian courts, looking into how they have addressed the gender dimension of health. That is my first point. So in 2012, we had a very significant instance of compulsory licensing being issued by the Intellectual Property Appellate Board. And one of the features that is relevant for today's discussion is that the price was brought down of a patented medicine by 97%. So that was one of the conclusions of the compulsory license that was granted in India in 2012. This is the only instance that we have had in a post-TRIPS era in India. The other significant decision is quite recent. I've written it as 2022 by the High Court of Kerala, wherein it was specific to a woman who was suffering from cancer, from HER2 breast cancer, and she was unable to get the medicines to treat her as a result of the high price of the medicine. What subsequently happened is that during the pendency of the case, she passed away, but the court did mention that these kind of issues need to be really addressed by the regulators in India, especially if it comes to pricing of a drug. So this case is still pending before the Delhi High Court or before the Kerala High Court. That's why I've just mentioned it here. So keeping those two concepts as to how India deals with prices, I have developed a method of linking the FTAs with medicines and patents and gender. So I have selected FTAs which very clearly show a health dimension in their agreement. And then I have tied it up with news reports that identify major pharmaceutical companies that are importing into India, or any collaborative efforts between India and the other country that can be found through the FTAs. The next step is to identify the government details or the government information that is available with regard to pricing of that particular product. So this linkage that I had to develop is what took a lot of time, because it is not freely publicly available. We had to develop those linkages in order to get some conclusion. And finally, the role of patent and the role of gender. So when I speak about the India-Japan FTA, I hope that what I'm trying to convey will become a bit more clear. So the India-Japan relationship began from 2011 and it continues till date. The latest development is that there are certain subcommittees that are to be formed in the direction of strengthening India's relationship with Japan and vice versa. India has also experimented, India and Japan both have experimented in something known as the PPH, or the Patent Prosecution Highway, which as of today stands terminated. It was a 3-year experimental period where certain benefits would be given if Japanese companies or individuals want to get a patent in India, which did not work out. But the point is to establish the closeness between the two countries. When it comes to articles, the two relevant articles on health is about the field of cooperation and cooperation on generic medicines. So this is what we found. The slide that all of you can see is what we found. So just for illustrative purposes, very easily I could see that there are two major companies, that is SI Pharmaceuticals and the Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma Corporation, who showed a lot of interest in importing their patented medicines into India. And what happened is that the first one, lenvatinib, is a cancer medicine, and its price, as you can see, is 12 times higher from the 12 times higher from the highest price and 4 times higher from the lowest price in India. So it's very much considerably much higher when it comes to other available options in the market. So this treats a type of cancer. It treats thyroid cancer, but also many other types of cancer. And what I could also see is that thyroid cancer has shown a significant rise in incidence in India over the recent decades, particularly among women in urban regions. And in local data collection that the government of India collects, urban women especially are seen to have a higher incidence of cancer over the past few decades.
3 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Right. The next one is also a medicine related to cancer, which again was very highly priced. So that is of SI Pharmaceuticals. In the Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma Company cases, again, cancer medication and diabetes medication, where we saw that Indian companies and Indian individuals successfully opposed the filing of the patent. right? So these are two examples. Now, why are we looking at women and medicines? So in general, there is a lot of literature available that when the medicine price of a disease specific to women is high or goes high, inevitably women stop taking that medicine because they have other responsibilities or liabilities. So the last paragraph is what is really important, that the minute the price of the medicine goes high and it falls out of availability for treatment, women stop treating themselves. So that is the important part when it comes to at least this FTA. So because my time is almost up, when it comes to concluding remarks, I still have to look at other FTAs with similar clauses. India is also negotiating other free trade agreements. And if we can look at specific examples and see the adverse effect that it has had on women, that would be at least a representation or a way to collect evidence to show that this is, this is affecting women, at least adversely, in the case of cancer, for example. It's also important to point out that India is a welfare state, as courts have said, as the law says, and as the constitution says. And that is also a dimension that has to be reflected when negotiations happen to bring forth an FTA. So that is it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. So if anyone has any question for Tanya, you can just ask now and she'll answer at the end of the panel discussion. So anyone from the audience, any question for Tanya? No? Okay, one question.
Very interesting research. Thank you so much for the presentation. Tanya, I was wondering what you think about women's access to vaccines, especially in pandemics and health crisis. Because when the pandemic happened, women were the last ones in developing countries. In India, there was a huge vaccine access gap between men and women that studies have shown. So have you done any studies in that respect? And the high patents of pharmaceutical products, which are even further heightened and strengthened by trade agreements. Do you think, is there a way to sort of harmonize the conflicting interests between the private industries who want to maximize their profit by keeping the number of patent years really high on these medicines, and human rights and right to live and access to live for women and other marginalized communities? Is there a way to harmonize or reconcile these two conflicting interests? Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? No? Okay. I would just like to ask Tanya one small question, not a question per se, but since your study is focused on India, in India, women are, there's a distribution of free medicine for women in rural areas. So have you considered that aspect? What kind of medicines or the quality, if they are being affected by the patent system, or any kind of study you have done in that regard for your study? Thank you, Tanya. Next will be, our next speaker is present here. It's Pia Conchi. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm grateful to the Institute of International Studies for organizing this important conference. I am a professor, a full professor of international law at the University of Teramo in Italy. I got a PhD in international economic law at Bocconi University under the supervision of Professor Giorgio Sacerdoti some years ago, and I have been the coordinator of 2 German modules, and one is ongoing concerning disinformation. And so I am particularly interested in discussions about language. Having said that, my topic today is about the special determinant of women's equality and empowerment, that is sexual, reproductive, and maternal health. The effectivity of this particular aspect of women's health depends on cross-border economic transactions. In particular, depends on imports, exports of pharmaceutical treatments, tests, and education kits, biomedical technology, as well as investments in the cross-border delivery of healthcare services, particularly innovative, technologically advanced healthcare services. Many international organizations have underlined that a positive interplay among trade, investment, and innovation can be established to enhance women's sexual, reproductive, and maternal health. And this can be achieved by the convergence of interests and aims through the achievement of sustainable development. In effect, access to quality, age, and gender-responsive sexual, reproductive, and maternal health is at the root of three specific sustainable development goals. Sustainable Development Goals number 3, 4, and 5. And this particular aspect of women's health is an intergenerational issue. So it matches very well with the Sustainable Development Agenda. Further, from this perspective, there are other relevant regulatory pieces that can be considered. New generations of international trade and investment agreements are no longer only pro-investors and pro-trade. And we already understood this in light of previous presentations. We can find in contemporary new generation international trade and investment agreements references to sustainable development as such, or to specific objectives, concerns that are important for the achievement of sustainable development. These innovations are usually included in non-relaxation clauses, provisions, in treaty preambles, and or text, or in general exceptions to treaty treatment obligations like Article 20 of the GATT agreement, or in exceptions to treaty obligations concerning the prohibition of performance requirements, or in specific special safeguard clauses, caveats, regarding the protection of a state's regulatory capacity to act in the pursuit of public interest like health, the environment, cultural heritage. Health is one of the common recurrent interests that we can find as exceptions or safeguard clauses in these new generation international trade and investment agreements. But we find a general, very vague sometimes reference to health. We find undetailed and unspecified clauses or provisions. And because of this trend, we don't find specific reference to sexual, maternal, reproductive health of women. On the other hand, even these innovative chapters on gender and trade, gender and investment, that can be considered another emerging non-investment injection or non-trade injection into the typical international regulatory framework on trade and investment. And this special chapter on gender equality are not connected with this other kind of exception safeguard clauses. As we already understood, trade and gender equality usually refer to gender equality as an economic matter. So we find these important references to access to services, in particular finance services, digital trade, equal labor opportunities, but there is no specific express connection between these gender chapters and the exceptions related to sustainable development. So I go straight on to my concluding remarks. First, we might need, I think we need, further revisions of the international typical regulatory and policy framework on trade and investment, but policymakers might experience negotiating difficulties. Of course, further innovation in the typical regulatory framework would be more effective in order to prevent conflict of interest and later on disputes. But as an alternative, we could rely on arbitrators, experts, judges in case of disputes due to the application of international trade and investment agreements to the detriment of women's sexual, reproductive, and maternal health. Of course, arbitrators, judges enjoy great discretionary powers. So they could refer to general principles like proportionality or special other interpretative criteria and methods in the interpretation and application of the applicable treaty. They could even choose the standard or review method by referring, for example, to deference to the host state or to the contracting state that want to protect women's sexual, reproductive, maternal health, although there are applicable treaties that are not so in favor. But this might be, and this is actually an uncertain point. We are not certain that it depends on a case-by-case situation. Another alternative to further treaty negotiations could be rely on multinational enterprises as such, as the drivers of treaty-driven liberalization. Multinational enterprises could make the difference by integrating this particular aspect of women's health and women's equality into their business model by enhancing their corporate social responsibility models. We would be in a non-binding perspective, but multinational enterprises could, at least a few of them, could do this in order to have gains in terms of their profitability and social impact. An additional alternative to treaty negotiations could be using international organization much further in order to promote state consultations, in order to adopt model clauses or model interpretative guidelines, specific, model interpretative guidelines concerning recurring issues for the prevention of normative conflicts. And last, yes, perfect, thank you, because last but not least, my last but not least remark is about the enhancement of this particular aspect of women's empowerment and equality through special projects by networks of researchers and stakeholders that can later promote state actions and policymaker decisions. And so I think that we, as are a good, might be a good starting point from this perspective. Thank you very much for your kind attention and once again for having me. Thank you.
Again, I open the floor for questions, if any. No? Okay, then we move on to our next speaker.
So is it 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10. Yeah, okay. Okay, so our next speaker is Nadia, Hasham, and Agnes. Are you with us?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you virtually, though we're sad that we couldn't be here in person. My colleague Agnes is also on the line. I'll just share my screen in the meantime. I'm a trade economist, and what we're going to present is research that we did when I was at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And Agnes is also in a similar area and does a lot of strategic advisory for entry into the African market. So we're coming from the African perspective And we will be transitioning from the trade agreement side, looking at the on-the-ground realities of accessing trade finance in the African context. I will just lead, but I'll ask my colleague Agnes to come in as and when. So we'll share the presentation. Great. So what we looked at this was a study that we did that looked at cross-border traders specifically and how they leverage trade finance and to what extent they're leveraging trade finance and what types of alternatives they're using or what might some of the barriers be. And the context that we were operating in was that we know that generally, by the way, I think the screen is showing, yes. Okay, good. So we know that generally the evidence that we have so far suggests that SMEs are not really leveraging trade finance. And we wanted, especially women, and we wanted to find out why that's the case. Because trade finance is a type of product which doesn't need a lot of collateral, and it should be easier to access if you already have export orders. So we wanted to find out why. And we also are operating in the African context where now we have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and we need for SMEs to be able to leverage the agreement, we need some of these tools in place and in use of those tools. And we also recognize that digital platforms to support finance, access to finance are up and coming. And so we wanted to see what all of this means for trade finance. We also, in the literature, we see that, and from our own experience, that women and especially youth, the transactions that they are doing are lower value. There's a perception that they are riskier, and this makes them less attractive generally to suppliers, to providers of finance. But there's a limit in terms of the data that's available on this exclusion, on their actual level of riskiness and why they're not taking up these solutions. Some of it might be relating to these perceptions or to cultural norms. Some of it might be a lack of coordination around the ecosystem and some of the solutions. So we tried to look at this a little bit more closely. And we did a study that was looking at the channels of this finance, the nature and the gender dimension of accessing finance, trade finance specifically, the digital solutions, and providing some recommendations out of this. So we looked at the literature, and that was more of the scoping that we did to come to the research questions and look at the existing evidence. But we looked at the demand side, and we found that there's a lot of work that's been done on the supply side, but we really wanted to understand the demand side of what's happening with the businesses that are meant to leverage this trade finance. We also consulted with IFC in doing this because they had done some work on the supply side and were also looking at the demand side. So how are those SMEs engaging with trade finance, and what is the scale of those barriers? So we did a survey. We covered these 5 countries here, but with the results we're going to show you focus on Nigeria and Kenya as case studies. So we did a survey. We managed to reach more than 300 SMEs that are engaged in cross-border trade, most of them women, and many of them youth as well. And they tended to be concentrated in specific sectors. So many in services, trade and services does dominate, though it has a different element in terms of financing, a different dimension. But we also had many in manufacturing, in textiles, fashion, beauty, agriculture, of course, and tourism as well in the services side. And many of them were classified as small. And in Nigeria, and specifically, more than half of the businesses had a workforce that was dominated by women, and most of them were formally registered. Of course, not being formally registered is already a barrier to being able to access finance. So that's one of the reasons we found. And then on the Kenya side, most of the businesses we surveyed actually had a women heavy workforce, and they were all formally registered. So some of our findings. So we found that SMEs tend to self-exclude from even applying for trade finance, even though they're banked. And so there's this narrative in the literature that Sometimes these businesses do not have bank accounts, they're not accessing formal financial products, but in fact, we found that the majority of them are. It's just that they're not applying for this trade finance. And despite that, they say that trade finance would be critical to the success of their business. So this is really, this really shows the gap, the scale of the gap that we're talking about here. Most of them talked about lack of information as one of those main challenges, but also complex processes and collateral. And this brings us also to the aspect of the perceptions of what they might need to be able to access this financing. And often that perception is not necessarily true. So they haven't gone through the process of actually understanding what those requirements might be. So here we find that there's actually a knowledge gap, an information gap that's creating this barrier. And just skip. So what the constraints that we found in terms of when we asked about what are the most acute, it was the high collateral requirements. And so again here, as I mentioned, we have the perception, but we also have this aspect of a lack of a credit history. So they're not really engaging with financial products to the extent that they would have a risk profile with these financial institutions, that a financial institution would be able to look at a business and say, assess their level of risk and assess whether they would be willing to lend and at what rate they would be willing to lend to this business. Many of them are multi-banked. They're using different financial institutions. They're using mobile money. They might not have their formal transactions coming through the bank. And this is the complex application process then becomes even more complex if their documentation is not in order. So a lot of these challenges that are mentioned actually discourage the SMEs from applying in the first place. And from the gender perspective, women reported 3.6 more times than men having facing these challenges, especially when going to a bank, and men were much more likely to access trade finance. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. You have 3 minutes left. Okay,
perfect. Great. Okay, and then why are they rejected? So the ones who do apply, we find that the rejection rates are mostly because, on the smaller amounts, in fact, and mostly relating to agriculture. And we know that agriculture is quite difficult for banks to assess the risk of. So that's one of the reasons. We also had limited presence of banks in some of the areas that the businesses wanted to operate in. But the reasons for rejection were varied. So credit score was particularly acute for women. So this is the fact that they don't have a history, but many of these reasons might be perception based. And this kind of brings us to the final point, which is looking at what businesses do in this case. And so we see that friends and family are a big source of where women go. Sometimes they do go to the digital platforms. And here we do find some challenges because digital lending can be easy. It doesn't have a lot of complex processes, but it can also have very high rates and predatory practices. And so this also makes it could be a risky option. And we find that in the literature that digital tools can actually help reduce the gender gap. So women can have wider access to these tools through digital platforms and through things like mobile money. And it can also help provide alternative methods of risk assessment. So we have to find a more effective way of using these tools. I want to bring in Agnes before we finish. Agnes, please go ahead on some of the regulatory side.
Thank you, Nadia, and it's great to be here. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So as Nadia a lot of, and I just want to speak on that before I quickly speak on the regulatory solutions. So family and friends, given the size of the transaction, so the family and friends were a key source of trade finance, alternative source of trade finance for a lot of women. Kenya, a good example where we have the cooperative or informal setup where people can lend and lend to each other. those were very critical for women, particularly women in cross-border trade. So the circles, as we call them, Nigeria, whose financial sector is fairly developed in comparison to other countries, we saw a respondent accessing trade finance through microfinance institutions and also through friends and family. And as also Nadia highlighted, one of the difficulties with sourcing financing for business from your family and friend, if a transaction fails, then family relationships are broken. But also, it's an opportunity for financial institutions that this is a constituent that they are being missed out. And if there are products or services that are available for them, they are a good market for financial institutions. So Nigeria, in responding to the gap in trade finance and in their effort to facilitate trade finance access, they introduced a Collateral Registry Act in 2016.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but your time is up, so if you can wrap up.
I'm going to. And so these allows SMEs to use movable assets like inventory, equipment, and accounts receivables as collateral for the purposes of accessing trade finance. Kenya has a credit guarantee scheme, also again in an effort to try and support SMEs access to trade finance, and again the Digital Credit Providers Regulation Act in Kenya. So there is a lot of response from the regulators to try and support SMEs, and also a lot of our governments realize the value, particularly women in cross-border trade and informal sector, the value they bring to promoting trade. So therefore there are initiatives through government, but women are finding their own solutions to address the trade finance gap. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Oh, we have a question. We have two questions from the audience.
Thank you. Just wondering about in part of your surveying, was there an average amount or size of the loan that was at play, and maybe was there a causal relationship between the size of the amount of the loan and the rate of rejection or acceptance in both Nigeria and Kenya?
Hi, Nadia. Sorry, she's a friend. So Nadia, my question for you is about access to trade finance, particularly for SMEs owned by women. So we did a study, and we launched a study by World Bank and WTO a couple of months ago, focusing on trade finance in Latin America. And their main finding was that SMEs do not have very little access in Central America and Latin America to trade financing instruments with banks, because they're not usually seen as reliable partners. When a crisis comes, they are the first ones to disappear. And that is even more the case with women-owned SMEs. So I wonder if you have looked into any risk mitigation factors and risk mitigation models that we can then propose to the banks for them to start seeing women-owned SMEs as more credible sort of partners, to offer them more trade financing instruments so they can expand their businesses and diversify their businesses and have more access to international trade. Because that being one of the key challenges outlined in the World Bank and WTO report, has been an issue in Central America and in Mexico in particular, and we haven't been able to locate sort of a solution to this.
Thank you. And now we'll give the speakers time to consider the questions and move on to the next speakers. The next speaker is Jennifer Curtin and her team, or friends, I don't know. Please go ahead, Jennifer. See anyone else from the whole list? No. Okay, we'll move on to the next speakers in line, and if Jennifer or anyone else joins, please let us know. So our next speakers are Nehal Yadav and Saurav Tiwari. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Hello, greetings everyone. I hope the PPT is clearly visible. Okay. I am Saurabh Tiwari with my co-author Ms. Nehal, and we are students from NLU Jabalpur, India. We are privileged to be able to present our idea in this wonderful conference on a topic that is very much needed to be discussed and worked upon. Before we begin, I want to refer to a very important point highlighted by Amrita Mehri ma'am in the panel discussion just an hour ago. She emphasized that the true purpose of academic discussions like this conference is not merely to identify barriers, but to systematically magnify them with structured legal backing. Because only then we can move toward standardized and effective solutions. In a very similar approach, our paper attempts to magnify a barrier that is extremely common yet remains largely invisible in trade law discourse, the pink tax. The pink tax the pink tax refers to a consistent pattern where products marketed towards women cost more than nearly identical products marketed to men. This difference is not driven by quality, composition, or safety features. For example, very basic products such as these helmets, there is no difference in quality or safety features. Both share the same purpose, but the price for one is higher simply because it's pink in color. This practice seems very small and basic, but its routine and systematic use makes it a very big problem for women. This manipulation is especially evident in personal care products, toys, and for over 800 plus products used worldwide. This is evident in also in practices such as salon, laundry, dry cleaning, etc. When we dig deeper, the pink tax reveals an entire landscape of concealed pricing tactics. There are no explicit gender-based tariffs written in law, except some states such as US, which is in harmonized tariff schedule system imposes a 16.7% tariff rate on women clothing, which is 2.9% higher than average for men. The companies often justify this by claiming higher production or packaging cost. But multiple studies shows that the costs are identical, but only the marketing is different, which is using a common approach that is shrink it and pink it, and women will buy it at a higher price. This shows that how they are using gender stereotype to use such or justify such practices. Here, we attempted to characterize the practice of fintechs as a tariff barrier within the framework of GATT. This characterization is important because it determines that which legal tools or policy responses become available to us. Under WTO law, the pink tax, especially when it takes the form of higher custom duties on products marketed to women, in legal terms can be considered as a tariff. It is imposed at the border, scheduled in tariff bindings, and it raises the import prices of goods. So, in both legal form and economic effect, the pink tax functions exactly like any other tariff barrier. However, whether this tariff is prohibited by GATT is an entirely separate question because there is no explicit prohibition on setting differential tariff rates between product categories that happen to be differentiated on gender basis only. Current GATT obligations, especially drawing analogy from most favored nation rules or national treatment rules, they regulate how members treat each other or how members treat products import and export in by countries in each other, but they do not classify how these products are differentiated on the basis of tariff. This means that the pink tax is a tariff barrier, but it is not automatically unlawful under any WTO rules. And this is precisely why a strong policy response is necessary. From the last 2-3 decades, the pink tax becomes widely recognized thanks to various public campaigns such as Rethink Pink campaign, and also a petition mass petition by peoples against a French supermarket Monoprix, which outraged the global outcry. And then the one act, the first of its kind, California tried to pass a gender tax repeal act in 1994 to make it illegal to charge women higher prices for equivalent services. But the act did not enter into force due to some reasons. And that's why till now there is no solution that is able to solve this issue.
Greetings to the panel. The economic consequence of the pink tax are severe. Women already face a gender wage gap. The pink tax adds an additional financial burden by increasing the cost of essential goods and services. Some studies show women paying up to 42% more for identical services. This reduces women's competitiveness as entrepreneurs, workers, and consumers. The pink tax is not just an unfair price markup, it becomes a structural penalty on womanhood, reinforcing what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen described as the natality inequality, which means systematic discrimination embedded in societal and economic structures. Next, in the fourth segment of our paper, we have attempted to establish what policy measures can be taken against pink tax and what remains the underlying obligations for such an enforcement of the policy. I would like to discuss three primary underlying obligations first. Firstly, are the obligations under the GATT and the GATS. The GATT, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, and the General Agreement on Trade and Services, in their Articles 20 and Article 14 respectively, provide for a general exception. The purpose of this exception, as we know, is to allow a deviation from the agreement if it attacks the underlying value mentioned in the provisions. This also implies that the GATT and the GATS wish to fundamentally preserve these values. We propose that the practice of pink tax goes against the protection of public moral principles mentioned in these exception clauses. Since females having to pay more are not only affected as consumers but also half the population of the country, these can fit in as.
You have 3 minutes left.
Sure, ma'am. I'll just sum it up. These can fit in as a catch-all exceptions found in the FTA and used to protect economic interest subject to countries' moral interest. Further, there is also a mention of protection from fraudulent deceptive practices, and we propose that when marketing strategies are such to label identically same products as pink just to be able to justify the higher value pricing, it can be classified as a fraudulent deceptive practice. Second is the Article 36 of General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which aims for raising living standards and promoting progressive development of economies. In the case of pink tax, the situation of living standards of female is worsened when it is coupled with other existing issues such as the gender pay gap. This is detrimental to progressive development of economies. Next obligation is the more recent one and more directly connected. It is the Joint Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, also known as the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, 2017, which was a commitment by World Trade Organization member countries to create a more inclusive trade agenda that promotes women's participation in the global trade. Dear esteemed panelists and academicians, please note that these obligations may not seem direct, but we have humbly attempted to connect them to the pink tax in the context for policy action. Next, we move on to the certain policy suggestion. I will just briefly summarize it. Firstly is the root of FTA, as we have seen that general exceptions of GATT and GATS provide for an obligation. If these exceptions can be fit in FTA together, supported by and negotiated under the Buenos Aires Declaration, this could initiate the process of combating the pink tax, at least at the bilateral trade levels. Next, we suggest that there shall be a cost verification protocol in place. As we have seen above, companies often justify pink tax as genuine production cost differences. Thus, to counter the systematic protocol of analyzing cost differences can be adopted in this regard. And to answer the question that are there really cost differences, as it might actually be the case, for instance, in the hygienic products when there are when they suit the differential hair growth patterns in the males and females, and so the costs for razors differ. Next, the WTO has a pre-shipment agreement in place. Though it functions on a separate parameters, if we adopt a similar pre-shipment analysis in furtherance of a cost verification protocol, to check, are there any price differences happening? The data repository for such a product details can be maintained for further regulations. And lastly, a reward mechanism wherein WTO provides incentives to production units and countries taking positive measures in this regard. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions? We have a question from the audience.
I have a question online if I can.
Jane has his own.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Very interesting. This is an area that we have done some research at OECD. So what we found in our research is that when we look at actual tariff rates, there are differential tariff rates only between only in the area of clothing and apparel, where you can actually identify, clothing and apparel tariff lines that refer to women versus, men's clothing. And we looked at these actual tariff rates for pretty much, many different regions. I'm not sure if we looked at India, but we looked at the Middle East, we looked at Latin America, and we looked at OECD countries, and really found very, very little difference in recent periods between the actual applied or, negotiated tariff rates. The difference was that women spend more on clothing, and women's clothing has a higher import value. So they're actually paying more in terms of tariff amount, but the actual tariff rate is the same between, say, a men's suit and a woman's suit. So I was wondering if you'd actually looked at the tariff rates and the actual tariff revenue that is that has been collected, and which areas, if you did, which areas of the world you looked at. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Jane, because I would like to follow up on you. I think, first of all, that this rate difference is minimal and affects only a limited number of products. Second point is that women don't, especially in developing countries, don't buy only for themselves. Women buy for the good of the household. So they buy goods for themselves, for their husbands, for children. So this idea that women buy for themselves, so they are highly penalized because of the pink tariff. I think we are building up on something that looks to me as kind of a non-issue, because first of all, because of the little difference in tariff. Secondly, because women buy for the household and not only for themselves. So perhaps I am missing something in this, and you can really highlight what is the real question that I can answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I completely agree with you, Simonetta and Jane, but I do want to add, when I was in Kenya, Nadia, maybe you can elaborate on that. I remember that we had an expert who presented a study based in Africa. There was few case studies in East African countries where they showed with concrete numbers that few very limited products, but centric to women, tampons and sanitary pads. In Africa, the custom duties between inter-African trade for these two products, the custom duties were as high as 40%, 40. And that is an abnormally high tariff rate to be charged on products. on hygiene products.
But this is not comparing men and women products. These are only women products.
Yes.
So it's another kind of issue.
Yes.
To have a high taxation on women exclusively products. And another thing is to compare men products and women products. And I think the presentation was about the comparisons, not about.
I saw the presentation. From my perspective, I think the presentation was about the products which are catered for women's market, for women consumers. And so I think that to me, sanitary pads and tampons being rated at 40% is very central to women. And when you talk about pink tariff, so a few years ago, World Bank and WTO, they had this book published, and they had a chapter or 2 chapters on pink tariffs, and they made a strong case about that. So I do agree with what you're saying and what Jane has said with the interventions, but I also think that pink tariffs do exist. They do exist specifically for cosmetics and these hygiene-based products in a few developing countries because the tariffs are so high. So I do see the sentiment as to where this research on pink tariffs is coming from. But we can always debate this later.
Thank you so much for the questions. Next, we'll be moving on to our next presenter, Alisa Zido. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction and of course also for giving us the opportunity to present our study. So the name of the study that we have done is Escape and Burden, the dual role of exporting for African women entrepreneurs under institutional constraints. And to give you a little bit of background without, of course, digging too much into details about what we know from the theories, what we know from other studies, but what is definitely happening if we look at the context of sub-Saharan Africa, we know that they do have a very high amount of female founders, which is amazing. But we also know that local markets are challenging. So what usually happens, and it doesn't matter to how many female founders you talk, most of the times you hear in the interviews and in the conversations, the local markets is too challenging, there is not enough demand, I need to go abroad. So there is this kind of tendency to say, if I want to escape from the difficulties that I can find in my own local market, I need to escape from it. So my solution is I need to search for export opportunities. However, maybe to already kind of give a little bit of preview, what is interesting is that there were 2 countries in which we have not heard this sentence, and it has happened in Nigeria and Kenya, which I think it depends on how familiar you are with those countries. It's in a way kind of representing well the economic and entrepreneurial ecosystem that is kind of around, especially the bigger cities. And the challenge, however, is if escaping from the challenges in your own country and the local markets is exporting, that's wonderful. But we also know from different studies that as a female founder, you definitely have additional barriers, additional hurdles if you want to export. So the solution that you might face and say like, okay, let's go for exporting might not be that easy due to additional challenges. And that is leading us to our research question. So our research question for this specific study is how do institutional contexts influence the export strategies of African women entrepreneurs, and what are the consequences of actually relying on informal networks if you want to go for export and internationalization. To give you a little bit more of information, this study has been developed together with E-Trade for Women. It's an organization done by UNCTAD, and it comprises more than 300 female founders in the digital economy across different areas such as Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the African context. In this specific study, which is qualitative, so we did interviews, we have focused on a zoom on the African area. However, our idea is, and maybe that can be a good preview for hopefully maybe seeing each other next year again, we want to extend it also to the other regions in order to see other challenges and maybe also similarities or differences in our results. But this specific focus of the study has been, we have interviewed more than around about 33 women, and 13 different African countries. As I mentioned before, yes, we had definitely Nigeria and Kenya, but also Ivory Coast, Uganda, Rwanda. So trying to kind of cover the different areas where, of course, E-Trade for Women is present with the members. So to start with the findings, which is, I guess, the more interesting part, is the puzzling, let's say, phenomenon, something where we actually felt like, wow, what is happening here? So the first interesting number is we have seen that 64% of African women-led businesses that actually do export. And we were not expecting, let's say, such a relatively high number, because looking at the challenges, even though there is a strong demand, we said, okay, maybe we would expect something around 40 or 50%, but not 64%. However, looking deeper into what does it mean for you to actually go for exporting, which strategic value is behind it, we have seen another number which is very interesting. And that is 68% out of the previous number, so the ones that are exporting, of those businesses, only 1% up to 25%, the export is actually part of their revenue streams. Meaning that, yes, they do export, but the value that it has for their business, also in terms of growth, revenue growth, is rather limited. And so considering, and I'm pretty sure we are all aware of those challenges to do export for the very first time, if you come from those countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, Ivory Coast, and Senegal, etc., is rather challenging, and it takes not only a lot of time, but a lot of resources to get it started. So that is why we really wanted to better understand how comes that, yes, you go for export, but in the end, the impact that it has on your revenues, on your business, is rather low. So what happens is that we have seen a more, how can we say, we call it more like opportunistic, not planned, not strategically well-defined way of going for exporting. So most of the cases we have heard the story why they were going for exporting in the interviews. We had names from their friends and family and other kinship ties that were somewhere other in the world saying that, oh, I believe it would be fantastic to see your products also in our market. And that happens that then, even though without knowing the market, they were just basically going for the export opportunity. So that is why we have this focus on relying on informal ties and networks to actually go for exporting, which is, of course, a very important opportunity. To put it in a nutshell, what I would like to present is the model that we have built based on the interviews we have done. And it starts, of course, with the women saying, okay, we would actually kind of like to go into exporting. I would like to explain this model by giving you one story, because most of the times one story tells more than just simple categories that we need to put out of a study. So there's one case, her name is Mary, which is really her name, and she's happy with me sharing her story. She's located in Kenya, in Nairobi, and she works on interior design. So she has different products that are made of mango wood. They're really beautiful, and she is very much focused on the local market, but similar to the case, she said, the market is challenging. We are going closer also to elections. I need to kind of get ready in order to ensure my business will survive. She had a good friend that actually went to the Bahamas, and she moved there because of kind of family responsibilities. And she said, I would love to see your products here as well. She went for it. She went through all the process, which was very challenging. How many times she got sent back from an office because they didn't want to talk to her because she is a woman. So she needed to ask her husband, who has nothing to do with her business. She made it. The products were to the Bahamas. They were not sold. She, in the end, needed to get the products back to Kenya, to Nairobi. The amount of time and financial resources that had cost her this first escape to say, like, it's wonderful, I have a good contact, let's go to the Bahamas, was fantastic. But in the end, it has cost her so much. And this is not, let's say, this is one story, but we have heard it throughout the 33 women we have interviewed. And what is interesting here is that we have seen that this actually is then reinforcing your challenges that you were escaping from the very first beginning. Because if you then focus on the wrong activities in your business, you have additional institutional barriers to go for export, and this actually harms and blocks that you can really build up your business. So what we want to kind of showcase with our study is that exporting is not made for everyone. And it is not the wonder, let's say, weapon easily said to say if the local market is challenging. And so we really need to increase the awareness of most of the women to understand what it really means to go for export. It doesn't matter if it's the Bahamas, if it's the European market, most of the times it's not that easy to sell your products abroad than you actually expect it to be. So what to do differently? Especially by sharing those insights also with the community of female founders in Nairobi in September. We did an event with more than 80 participants. We really suggested move away from the unplanned kind of approach towards export. You need to have strategic evaluation. There might be a wonderful opportunity based on informal networks, but it can't be it. Be more suspicious and try to really understand if there is a market fit between which products and or services you can offer and how the market abroad is and if there is really an opportunity. Institutional support needs to really push that very strongly, not only to say, we get you ready because we explain to you how the process is and that makes it easier. No, understand if there is actually a market demand, because otherwise you kind of push female founders especially to export their products, but they might actually come back and it's more negative than a positive kind of impact. And creating the awareness to really understand what it means to have a successful case of exporting and understanding the challenges that are coming with the fact of going abroad with your products. Here are the authors. It's not only myself, but also Marianne. She is from South Africa, but unfortunately due to sickness, she can't be with us. Thank you so much.
So much. Any questions? Okay, we have a question. We do not have it. We have maximum 7 minutes long. So okay. One question. One question. We have one presentation. No, one person is not present here.
Yeah. Very quick question. Yeah. Have you asked those women you interviewed if they were catering to the diaspora?
So we move on quickly to our next speaker, Judith Fabian.
Oh.
I'm very interested.
So my presentation, this is sort of like a moving target in so many ways. My research is a moving target, and the cases that I'm presenting are a moving target as well, because they're sort of going through the system. And I particularly thought that this gathering might be interested in how these cases are developing. So Canada has done a lot of wonderful things in the trade and gender space, and I'm sure that we are all aware of it. But things are not perfect, and it's businesses that trade. And it's businesses that trade, and some of them are not always acting in ways that are very positive. So obviously, we have to deal with those instances. So. And over the past decade, some of the cases that had been going through the courts created basically a situation where things are evolving in a way that perhaps will be or might be overturning traditions of over maybe even a century. So basically, quickly, so Canadian business practices abroad, human rights and gender equality. The problem here is that Canada's rhetoric and wonderful actions in the trade and gender and human rights space in support of human rights and gender equality does not readily match the actions of a reasonable number of Canadian companies abroad. And that is just the reality of the situation. So violations of human rights are especially concerning in the companies specializing in resource extraction in developing countries, particularly mining. The three cases that I wanted to examine here is Parte, Tehu, and Newsom. Each case concerns human rights violations by Canadian companies or their subsidiaries in developing countries, namely Guatemala, that would be Parte and Tehu, and Eritrea, which would be Newsom. In each, the companies defend themselves by claiming immunity or the illegitimacy of the charges under various forms of international law. So in terms of my analysis, there's no originality that is claimed in tying these three cases together. Their subject matter is closely related, and the connection has been made by NGOs and at least one academic publication, which is just sort of came out during the first year of the pandemic. However, to articulate the significance of the developments the cases represent is more difficult and varied and valuable work. And so what I'm trying to do here is to show how they point towards overturning a particular tradition of transnational corporate impunity. So in terms of Parte, between 2007 and 2009, Guatemalan police, military and security officials employed by the subsidiary of Parte Minerals Inc. forcibly evicted Mayan residents from mining concession land owned by a subsidiary of Parte. In the process, 11 women were gang raped, one man was murdered, another man was shot, and numerous offenses of looting, vandalism, and arson were committed. The Ontario Supreme Court of Justice allowed the three suits from victims, the man who was shot, the widow of the murdered man, and 11 women who were raped to go to trial in 2013, significantly weakening the forum non-convenience defense. For the first time in Canadian jurisprudence, it was held that Canadian corporation could be held liable for the activities of its subsidiaries overseas. So the outcome, the final outcome of the trial at the time of writing the paper was still pending. If anything happened during the past 2 years, then let me know. Laura is shaking her head, so that's still the case. So it's going through, so it's a slow process. In the case of Tehu, in 2013, security guards at the Guatemalan subsidiary of Tehu Resources Inc. shot and injured several protesters. The British Columbia Supreme Court case was dismissed in 2015 on the grounds of forum non-convenience. This was overturned on appeal by the British Columbia Court of Appeal in 2017. In 2019, the parties settled. For many years, in the 2000s and 2010s, Nepson Resources Ltd. benefited from what amounted to forced labor conscripted by the Eritrean government at its subsidiary owned by Bisha Mine, which concerned gold, copper, and zinc in Eritrea, and numerous violations of East Hogan's norms were committed against mine workers. Violations included workers being paid about $1 a day, barred from leaving the work camp by offenses, punishments amounting to torture, and threats against their families. 3 escaped workers claimed damages against Newsom at the British Columbia Supreme Court. Newsom's defense was based on forum non-convenience, the Act of State doctrine, and the Supreme Court at the Supreme Court of Canada that customary international law had been misapplied. Forum non-convenience was denied by the British Columbia Supreme Court in 2016 and the British Columbia Court of Appeal in 2017. It was abandoned by the defendants at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2019. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that the Act of State doctrine was not part of Canadian law, and this is very significant. The Supreme Court further ruled that for the first time in 2020 that Canadian corporations and their subsidiaries could be held liable in Canada for breaches abroad of customary norms of international law, including use slogans. The parties, although the parties settled in October 2020. The Act of State doctrine is still in place in Australia and in the United Kingdom. So the defenses rebutted were the forum non-convenience doctrine that the jurisdiction should decline to judge a case whether a better suited jurisdiction is available. Traditionally, this meant the host country where the offense took place, which conveniently would decline to prosecute. Parte, Tehu, and Newsom have seen the defense significantly narrowed and weakened in its application. Oh my gosh. Okay, so in terms of the act of state doctrine, the defenses rebutted were that the judiciary of the sovereign state cannot, so the meaning that the judiciary of the sovereign state cannot legitimately judge the legality of the executive actions of another state. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled in 2020 that act of state is not part of Canadian law, having been subsumed by conflict of laws and judicial restraint. And again, in Australia and in the UK, it's still in place. And in terms of corporate immunity and the corporate will, Hudbay and Tehu and Newson have found that Canadian corporations can be held liable for actions abroad that are contrary to customary international law, including actions by their subsidiaries. So these are very, very significant. At the same time, they're very fragile. Some of the one of the decisions were basically 4-5 the Supreme Court. So the dissenting judges were very strongly in opposition to the judgment, to the opinion of the majority. So basically, where to go from here? So how will Hudbay end? How will the two Supreme Court dissenting opinions in Newson be received in academic literature and legal practice? What similar cases are pending, and what new cases will arise? Will there be a political reaction? If so, in what form and in what forum? And what is this theoretical significance of the developments here described, especially with respect of the projection of power internationally, the relative power of states and transnational corporations, and the health of democratic governance internationally? So there are a lot of questions, a lot of avenues that we can go. But I guess the main point I'm trying to suggest is that these three cases showed us that there is an avenue, there is a new development in the jurisprudence that can be referred to in future, and I'm sure that they will be referred to in future, and there will be discussions and thinking about it. Even if things move slowly, I think it's definitely a space to watch.
So, yes, everyone, I'm really sorry, but we're running a bit behind. So I would suggest we wrap it up here. I know we have some questions. For the online people, we will be more than happy to talk through the chat or via email. And for the people in person, we can, of course, discuss it while on the coffee break. So please, let's be back here at 11:55 so we are not too behind on the program. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, we are going to give each panelist 1 minute to answer the questions. Please be quick since we are running a bit behind. So we are going to start with Tanya.
Thank you. Very quickly, I was asked 3 questions, and one is about women's access to medicines, and the other was about free distribution of medicines to women. So this is like stage 2 of the research. As of now, I could cover only one part of it, but that is definitely on my radar. That is my answer. The second one is about harmonizing between private interests and generics. And the answer to that, which I tried to mention, was about using flexibilities that are available in TRIPS. So one example that I cited in my research was about the use of patent oppositions. So that is very much part of the research. But thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Next is speaker.
I think I didn't have.
You didn't have any questions. Okay. So moving to Nadia.
Yeah, thanks. So first question was about a correlation between the size of the loan and the rate of rejection. And yes, the smaller the loan, the more likely it was to be rejected, and especially for agricultural products. We can think of why this might be the case, but it's quite complex. And we didn't look further in too much detail at the other cross-cutting correlations. The second question was about the reliable partners question. And yes, this is exactly what we were talking about in terms of risk perception. So there is a perception that women are generally riskier, despite all the evidence that suggests that they're actually more reliable borrowers and repairs. A couple of the things that we're looking at to address that, projects that Agnes and I are working on, piloting a new model for bank interaction with women exporter clients to reduce the bank's cost of assessing their risk, and also the perceived risk of those businesses so that they have more data. Some of the digital tools can help us have a better risk profile of those businesses as well. So if they're using banking transactions, if they're using mobile money, we can actually better assess their risk. And one in Nigeria is the government policy aspect as well, is trying to reduce the risk, but they're also trying to look at a trade finance product that is guaranteed through business associations. And so the business association is providing, mitigating basically the risk because they can understand that client. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next, let's Neil and Saurabh.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your questions. About the question of concept of paying tax in a specific sector, I would like to mention that yes, it is clearly there in only clothing and apparel sector. It is clearly mentioned in US tariff schedule system in chapter 61 and 62, which provides for clothing and apparel and explicitly imposing tariffs on that. But this practice, as we have already emphasized, that this is a hidden practice that we want to uh, emphasize here. And most of the times, what happens, the products are there in country specific, and that's because they are not subject to any import or export. And in that case, the calculating tariff schedules or calculating custom duties on such products is next to impossible. And that's why we also advocate for working on such sectors by uh, more empirical research and uh, emphasizing or advocating for policy that works on both national and international level. Because sometimes, as one of the question is about women is buying for whole household, but because this practice is so much enshrined in sociocultural uh, and so much concealed, most of the times the women who is buying for whole household ends up uh, buying the identical products in higher prices for herself, for her daughter or her mother. And this concealed pricing tactics is what we want to uh, work upon, and we want WTO or the policy organizations to work more on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next is Alisa. You had one question?
Yes, I keep it short. So the question was if they are addressing the diaspora, and yes, we asked the question. Most of the times the informal network is part of diaspora and also the market, but it's part of the problem that it is a limited market they have access to. So having kind of the extension to also look at the broader market and selling products that would be interested for everyone, the mass market would be more interesting.
Thank you so much. I don't think we have any questions.
Can I just say that I bought this and there was a discount. No, it was discounted because of the color. Because of the in Italy, in Rome. I don't know what to say. I realized it. I was.
Thank you to all the panelists for bringing such multifaceted discussions to the podcast.
I was happy.
Thank you so much, and we'll be back in 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh.
You know, each one side.
Yes, yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes, and so we take, they're like, moving the target, like it's just sort of, you just sort of sit back and watch. That's what I do. I mean, that's what I do. I mean, I don't know if you're more actively involved, but I am in this. So, yes, yeah, I just watched too. And right. Have discussions. Okay, I'm really watching, that's it. Yeah. Do something I do. Yeah, and the thing is, like, we started it and it just like, it's just like. Yeah. Because it's a real life, thank you.
This is about the mining sector that you mentioned.
Sorry?
About the mining sector that you mentioned.
Yes.
Incidents.
Yes.
So is the mining specific, any specific methods and how critical?
Well, that's the thing, is that like, the question is like, how are these going to, like, are these going to speak to this rush for development? Yeah. Like, that's a big question. So these are already sector specific cases, and obviously they weren't shifted. So now we're so focused on getting critical minerals from all of these places. So the question is, are they going to sort of take advantage of, you know, the situation again? Yes. Yes. So is it going to negatively benefit?
Yeah, so that's even, this is what I was looking for. I'm saying, how many people represent on the spectrum when it comes to which is guys. Yeah, there's one thing. I mean, this is good. These are not yes. All are logging on the short. Yes. That's how all is better. Yes. So necesito registrar con más. Yes. Yes. So that it's definitely. Yes.
Sí, una.
So the landscape is a moving project, and it's, there's nothing to say that, you know, this is not going to like. It's not working.
Okay. There is a, es que yo voy a pasar, pero no me.